that.
I'm gonna get out and
Go.
Thanks for joining us for the FIPCO Community Health Fair. I'd like to share a few things with you. After this session, you will be sent a survey. Please do fill out the survey. We appreciate all the feedback that you may have. Also, if you have any questions, please do put them on the chat and we will ask those questions at the end of the presentation. You can find this recording as well as all the other sessions that have been presented throughout the fair at the page where you registered. So I would like to present Dr. Allen, who will be presenting on Alzheimer's and the patient and caregiver perspectives. Dr. Allen, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Shakita. I appreciate that. And I thank everyone who's on for joining us today. I'm going to try my slides. Yep, there they are. They're larger. For joining us today, and also just to have an opportunity just to thank FIPCO for inviting me not only to this presentation, but also to the presentation on all of us that I presented with my colleague, Mary McClendon, on Thursday. So as I get started, I just wanted to share a couple of things. This presentation does not particularly focus on Alzheimer's disease and related dementia and what it is. It focuses on Alzheimer's patient and caregiver's perspective, but there's a term that I'll be utilizing, and that's called ambiguous loss, because oftentimes when we think of the patient and the caregiver's perspective, we have to think of this term. I'll be elaborating on this term a little bit later, but I wanted to inform you that ambiguous loss is a term that has been identified when we're looking at the patient and the caregiver's perspective. So my title presentation is Ambiguous Loss, Living with Uncertainty. So what I'll be sharing just a little bit, what is dementia and Alzheimer's disease, what ambiguous loss is and why it is important, how it differs from other loss and grief, and new approaches towards increasing tolerance for ambiguity and change. So first, let's talk a little bit about dementia. I want to share with you that dementia is a term that we use very loosely and has been used interchangeably. Dementia is primarily identified as a disease, or in other words, a syndrome that identifies a particular disease as, that actually utilize these 5 words that you see here. We in the healthcare field and the area in which I work, we look at dementia as this umbrella, just as if we would look at cancer as an umbrella. It doesn't specify the particular disease unless you know exactly what type of cancer that individual has. The same with dementia. Dementia does not specify the disease unless you know particularly what type of dementia that individual has. Many of us have heard of various dementias such as Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and the list goes on. There are over almost 200 different types of dementia now based on these 5 categories that I'm going to share with you. When we say dementia, we say that the individual have a memory loss, short-term and long-term. And remember, dementia is not a reversible disease. It's not something that you can actually say, okay, I have it today and I don't have it tomorrow. It's a progressive brain disorder. So you will have memory loss, short-term, long-term. And as time goes on, that memory loss will get worse. You will have language issues, whether you are having issues with expressing certain things or comprehending certain things. Personality change. You'll see an individual that may behave or have some type of personality one moment, and then of course the next you notice that is not the person that you actually recall. Behavior, this is how that individual acts, how they act out. Again, that could be a person that you thought was just as sweet and never had an issue, but then now because of the dementia, the type of dementia they have, they begin to act out maybe aggressively. And then we also have judgment. That's the logical thinking aspect when we look at Alzheimer's disease or any type of dementia, That means that person doesn't think or critically identify certain things the way they have before. Now, remember, that is, again, the disease is progressing. The brain is now deteriorating because of the cells being infected by some form of dementia. So I just wanted to give you a little bit about what's going on with the individual when we identify them as having some type of dementia. Another thing I want to share with you is I shared with you the progression of dementia. It takes about 7 to 10 years at length. Now, again, that 7 to 10 years could be on the onset all the way up into 7 or maybe 10 years or greater. We've had some clients that have actually had some form of dementia as long as 15 years. But typically when a person is diagnosed, they will pretty much show a progression that leads to what we call the fifth stage, if you will, and that's that terminal stage that you don't see here. That terminal stage pretty much goes into hospice. So there are 3 different stages that are listed, but there are typically 5 stages when we look at some form of dementia. The first one is mild cognitive impairment. You'll see that person having some type of memory issues. Now, keep in mind, when a person has mild cognitive impairment, it does not mean that they're going to immediately go into a form of dementia. There are people, and I can share with you, I have family members who have actually had mild cognitive impairment and they live with it. That means that they have problems with remembering things, but they have coping mechanisms that will allow them to remember, such as Post-its or recording something on their phone. But most of the time, when people have mild cognitive impairment, I would say 60% of the time, 60 to 70% of the time, they do go into what we call a progressive stage of dementia. That is actually that early stage or mild stage. Then we have the moderate stage or middle stage, and then the late stage. The last stage, as I've shared with you earlier, is the terminal stage. And that's typically when we identify a person having those last 6 months of life, if you will, through hospice. Now, I also want to remind you that each of these stages require different services and strategy along the way. So now that I've enlightened you, or probably most of you may already know what dementia is, I just wanted to inform you about the diagnoses before we go into the perspective of the caregiver and also the patient who has dementia. And again, I'll be utilizing the word ambiguous loss. Now, what is ambiguous loss? Ambiguous loss is loss that is unclear, has no solution and no closure. That's similar to grieving. We've experienced that recently with a lot of loss through COVID. Unfortunately, when we see that individual or when we hear of our loved ones who may have died in ICU due to COVID or other type of diagnosis, the closure in our mind is the fact that we've literally seen them or we have experienced some type of loss based on what the hospital have shared with you. Well, with ambiguous loss, it's no closure, it's unclear. Now, when we look at ambiguous loss, I want you to look at that 4th bullet. This is when the person is physically still there, but psychologically they're gone. Now, this term has been coined or identified by a colleague of mine, Dr. Pauline Boss. What she's saying, and I'll give it in my terms based on my experience with my grandmother, is that the individual you can physically see, like in my case, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. I could physically see my grandmother was there, but in communicating with her, she was gone. There was no more grandmother to me. Now remember, the progression of the disease, that means she wasn't going to go back to where she was before, which means, again, I've lost my grandmother, but I may have gained someone else. And that's when I began to experience the loss. Again, this is the perception or perspective of the caregiver, me being that caregiver. And oftentimes this is what we were not or have not expected when we're caring for a person who has some type of cognitive impairment, such as Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. Now, in ambiguous loss, there's a missing link. The caregivers often report stress and burden, and that's because they can't figure out what's going on. Such as, again, I'll give you my example for my grandmother. For me, it was somewhat simple. It was cruel to my family members who said, why are you treating her like a child? Why are you talking to her that way? This is our grandmother. But because I knew the word ambiguous loss and knew what was going on, I could relate. So here, my family members were experiencing stress. They were burdened because they didn't see or couldn't associate themselves with this woman who used to be considered their grandmother. The concepts helps us understand this way. This may be related to chronic loss and grieving, such as, like I shared with my grandmother, I understood the concepts. So I knew that there was going to be some association. I also knew that I had to go through those stages, Kubler's laws, you know about them. I'm sure you've heard denial, anger, etc. And I did, I went through them, but not as hard or as difficult as my family because I knew about the ambiguous loss. Now, the model was developed to name or describe a unique type of loss. Unlike any traditional loss, as I've shared, loss that is unclear and there's no solution, resolution, or closure. And we understand that. For this situation, we're focusing on dementia. Now, I'll give you a little bit more about ambiguous loss just so that you can get some understanding. The physical body is absent, but psychologically, the person is still present to the family and loved ones. We can see it that way as well. In that case, that's when back, when we have wartime and we hear that the loved one has died, but they have not identified where the body's located. That can be a form of ambiguous loss, meaning the physical body is gone, but psychologically people believe or still are holding on to the fact that the individual is there, which is the opposite of what I share with dementia. Now here's the opposite, here's the actual portion of dementia. The body is present, but psychologically the person has changed, i.e. my grandmother. I could see this older woman who was 90 plus years of age, but psychologically I felt and understood that she probably in my mind and in hers was probably under 10, 8, 9, or depending on how she was going through the progression of the dementia. Loss is unclear, it becomes confusing, and in most cases for caregivers, it's unpredictable because we do not know when the individual is going to go from one stage to another. The only thing we can do is hold on to the last stage they are on and then move to the next as they move on. Moments of lucidity in the dementia, and that becomes confusing, as we know. You cannot have, there's no cure, there's no fix, only managed treatment. And as the patient or the person goes through the stages. And as I've shared, there's no closure. What do I mean by no closure? That means that when I go from mild stage, I don't know when moderate's gonna hit. So there's no closure to the last stage in which I was in. So I have to go along with my family member. So that caregiver, and again, this is from your perspective, the caregiver has to go along with the family member, that patient or that person that they're working with, because they can't tell you, oh, tomorrow my mom's going to start going into the moderate stage. You have to gradually just, again, journalize or identify those stages as the person goes on. Now, how does this differ from other losses? It's very, it complicates loss and grieving. I go back to what I said. We talked about the loss and grieving of those who lost their loved ones in COVID. When unfortunately, when that individual get the call, such and such is now being weaned off a vet, they're transitioning, and the list goes on because I don't even like to talk about it, but the person pretty much is now gone. You then go through the denial. I can't believe it. You become angry. And all of the Kubler stages that we're very familiar with. Here, you can't, because again, you don't know when you're going to get to that stage. Even when we talk about the patient or the person going into the terminal stage, which is their last 6 months, oftentimes those 6 months may be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or maybe even a month. So we really don't know when they transition. So it's difficult to define those areas. Continued losses throughout the course. Again, you're losing that person from one stage to another. I use my grandmother, for example. I've lost my grandmother from one stage, whereas she was basically my grandmother. When I live in Arizona, this situation occurred in Michigan. She resided in Michigan. By the time I got to Michigan and my family member called and said there was some things going on, she was no longer my grandmother. She was more so my mother, if you will, because of the cognitive decline that she had actually was exhibiting. She would call me her mom, my mom, and I'm her daughter. So again, as you can just imagine, she saw a female that may have been considered her daughter as opposed to her granddaughter because she was declining. And as time had gone on, I would say maybe less than a year, I got another call. When I got there, I was then considered her sister. What was interesting about that is the fact as she was declining and getting younger in her mind and age, and of course, as she was declining, I became the person that she seen me as. I was her sister for actually 3 years. So again, if you can just imagine as a caregiver, and I'm speaking to the caregivers from your perception, from your perspective of what you're seeing, I would have thought that I would have been her grandchild when I first saw her, or the last time I'd seen her, then her daughter, and then her granddaughter, or her, excuse me, her sister within stages. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. For the last 3 years, again, I was considered her sister. Now, right before she transitioned, I was her mother. So as she was progressing and declining, and again, her age in her mind was going down, she perceived me as an individual throughout those times in which she was progressing, an individual as it relates to her relationship. For that situation, I'll quickly go to bullet number 3. It confuses relationships. My grandmother. That was extremely hard for me, but it was also something that was enlightening because I was very familiar. I think the greatest or the most challenging relationships that I've seen go through these stages are spouses. Just imagine, as a caregiver's perspective, let's say the wife has Alzheimer's disease or some form of dementia, and she sees her husband, particularly as, her father, her brother, and then the list goes on. So that husband has to have some uncomfortable feeling because of that. So this is what's going on throughout these different stages. It's different than the typical grieving stages that I pointed out earlier. It's pretty much a stage that is within itself. And that's basically what we mean when we say the ambiguous loss, unaware of what might happen and how the outcomes will resolve. It's important to grieve as you go. So again, I like using my grandmother's situation as an example. Oh, trust me, I would fly into Michigan and visit my grandmother. And I think the time she considered me her sister, I got on the plane a couple of days later and I just wept. I cried because I knew how serious this form of dementia was, which is Alzheimer's disease. I knew that she was not going to ever go back to the grandmother that I knew. So I wept, and I wept because I lost that grandmother. I weep because I even lost that mother. Remember, she considered me her daughter. I wept, but then I began to reflect and say, well, wow, at least I am someone in her life, which was then her sister. As you all know, as a family member, and again, from the caregiver's perspective, sometimes you would be considered no one, a stranger. And that's even difficult because, again, here's a loved one that you've been caring for or even being with all these years, and now he or she doesn't recognize you. So again, this kind of gives you an idea of what happened through those losses. Now, the impact of dementia, as I've mentioned, it actually impacts the relationship. I use my grandmother and myself as an example. It impacts the intimacy. When we look at partners, husbands and wives, that husband who feels as though this is my wife and she has some form of dementia, unfortunately, I can never hold her hand the way I want to anymore. I can never give her a kiss the way I want to. I can never just cuddle up with her because her perception of me is now I'm seen as her father or her brother. So there's a loss right then and there. We know a very famous couple, African-American couple, Dan and B, and we heard those stories about how unfortunate situations, whereas he was with his wife until the bitter end. He basically cared for her. She lived in the home. There was a relationship. But I'm going to be honest with you, and this is me speaking on behalf as a researcher, a scientist, and then also as a caregiver. I would have to say we have to look at both pictures, both sides. And I do say that because there was such controversy when it comes to particularly the African-American families, whereas he cared for his wife in her home, in their home. And throughout the years, the care became, and I'm looking at bullet number 2, no longer a husband and wife, no longer intimacy, no longer was he perceived as her husband, but perhaps he may have been perceived as her father to her. And so therefore the relationship changed. Now we know there's controversy whether he should have brought someone in the home. We don't know if that should have happened or not, but whether he should have continued or built a relationship, that would be up to him. I think as a person looking on the other side, as a provider, a clinician and a researcher, That's a question we all have to answer for ourselves, but we also have to understand the disease. There was no more intimacy. There was no more true relationship as far as husband and wife. So then where would he have stood is the question we should have asked as opposed to why. Companionship and support and understanding, again, that's different. Communication could be different. There's no more communication how you may have had with your loved one. Again, I go back to my grandmother. There was no more, grandma, should I do this? Or grandmother, I love you, in the way that she and I would have actually communicated. My grandmother communicated very little at that time, but her communication, I have to chuckle because it was more so, when are we going to go out and play? Let's jump on the train tracks. When are we going swimming? Now you're probably wondering, where am I going with this? Well, think about it. That was my grandmother. She was from Florida. She lived in Florida at the time. She and her sister would play on the train tracks. And of course, they would go to the beach in Florida. So in her mind, she was probably this 15 or 16-year-old young lady or girl playing with her sister. And because I understood that, I just joined the journey, we call it. Shared hobbies, of course, they may differ. Those hobbies could be jumping on the train track, like I pointed out. Freedom to take part in activities or work. Lifestyle, that's how it's going to change as well. Future plans are going to be different, and implementing care. All of these are perceived as how this loss, this type of perspective or perception, if you will, from the caregiver standpoint will change. What is important? Well, what's important is we need to provide a pathway for the caregiver to accept and live with new reality. For me, it was easy, as I said, because I read about it. I studied it right at the time my grandmother was transitioning into these stages. For my family, it was challenging. So what happened, I had to teach them how to be better family members to my grandmother, and to understand that you were no longer the grandchild, or the child for that matter, from my father and my uncle's perspective. Some accepted it and some did not. So again, as a caregiver, I had to see it that way from my grandmother's lenses as a person who had some form of dementia. Allow us to appreciate our person for who they are now instead of longing for the person they once were. We have to be, more effective and use energy in a different way, and redefining our relationships. Some days I would walk into the facility, because my grandmother at the time was in a facility, and I literally would dress in coveralls, because I don't know if you remember back in the day when my grandmother grew up, and during the time in Florida, she and her sister wore coveralls or overalls, if you want to call them. And I would actually dress up with my old coveralls. I would actually braid my hair and walk in and say, hey, chum, because that was her nickname at the time. And she would smile and start saying something, pretty much garbling and saying some words that I didn't understand. But because of her way of communicating with me, because of her smile, because she clapped and just loved the fact that I was there, I was joining her journey. I accepted her for who she was. She would laugh and smile. I would roll her wheelchair into the garden of the facility, and we would just play. I don't know if you remember Color Purple. And at the time, Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg were actually I think it was another character, but they were in the flowers, the purple flowers, and they would say, me and you were, well, that's what my grandmother and I were doing. We were actually playing and just clapping with each other. And I knew at that time that was no longer my grandmother, but I also knew that if it was me, she would do everything she could to make me happy. So that's what I was doing. Again, from the perspective of the caregiver, and the caregiver basically is looking at that person who they're loving and caring for through their lenses. Why is it important? Again, changing our perception. We cannot control the disease. And again, the disease could be frontotemporal, vascular dementia, Alzheimer's, all of the things that I've shared with you, some form of dementia. We can control or change our perceptions when we are taking care of our loved one. It helps us find hope. I had hope with my grandmother. Some of my patients, when they're working with their loved ones, they have hope. They realize that there's an opportunity that I can still love on my spouse or love on my mother or my grandmother, but it's a different way. Pathways to accept and live with it. And again, that's what we have to do. We have to live with it. Helps us connect to the person as they are now with the disease. Conscious choice to change how we see things. Unfortunately, in my family's situation, I can tell you my cousin, who's a male, he had such a tough time. He would often call me and say, stop making a fool of grandmother. Why are you treating her that way? But to this day, he regrets the fact that he did not do the same thing I did. He said, you know, my grandmother's no longer here. She transitioned or died, if you will, in 2014. But he would say, cousin, I really wish I was actually joining the journey at the time you were, because I now realize that you had the best time with grandma and I didn't. I didn't want to accept it. So again, if I was to do this all over again, I would tell him this one, conscious choice to change how you see things. You could see them differently now because she's not who she was. And enables us to appreciate the person for who they are now. And I did, I appreciated her. Not only did I appreciate her, guess what? I utilized those positive moments to reflect and realize this is what she did when she was younger. So I understood who she was then and how she appreciated life. Why is it important? It provides guidelines to help develop our own plan to care for the person we love while caring for ourselves simultaneously. Now, you may have heard that I shared with you that my grandmother was placed in a facility. Yes, I did my research. Yes, I did. I believe I found one of the best facilities there. I can tell you with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, when you transfer a person from one state to another, you pretty much decrease their time of living. And that's because you've changed not only their whole perspective on what they've seen in the last few years. My grandmother's been in Detroit, Michigan, probably since 1940 something. So I'm going to say the age of 18 and 19 is when she moved to Detroit, Michigan. She transitioned or passed at the age of 90 something. So to pick her up and move her to Arizona would have probably increased her declination of not only memory, but life, because I changed her whole perspective, which would have truly confused her. So what I had to do was allow her to be there and also to care for her from afar. Almost done, thank you. Provide the model to increase resiliency. Why is it important? Offers fluid considerations. We are basically allowing ourselves to do, this is the most important, to provide a care and to take care of ourselves at the same time. And why is it important? Resiliency, resiliency, resiliency. You see most of the things that are listed on the slide. We have to be, in order to take care of ourselves. I was actually traveling recently and I could tell you, they said, put the mask on first before you put it on your family member, your child. And that's what you have to do here. You have to give yourself time to breathe and understand what's going on before you start taking care of others. How many minutes? One? No? None?
One. Yes.
So how do we begin? We actually recognize that ambiguous loss is a word. It can help us cope, create ambiguity, and also it has barriers to coping and grieving. We have to hold to opposing and contradictory ideas at the same time. There's no right answer. So even my story could be different than yours. Dan and B's could be different with yours. And also we have to trust that things will work out. How do we begin? And there's a book there. And again, this is something I began to read to reflect on how we begin. Again, find meaning, balance, control, acceptance, broaden your identity and manage your fixed outcomes. Again, hold on and let go, because we say hold on to the memories, but let go of what was there. Imagine how new hopes and dreams can take place, and take the time to mind yourself. Again, let go of your need for certainty and embrace ambiguity. Change your perceptions, find hope in ambiguity, and find meaning in the relationships as it go change. So as I end, this is the last thing I want to share. In this presentation, I just want to say a good enough relationship is what you want to find when you're looking at from the perspective of the caregiver and the family member. When you love someone with dementia, the goal is not perfection. The new standard for your relationship is simply for it to be a good enough. Life with dementia can be less than ideal and still be pretty good. The perceptual change is under your control. So as I end my presentation, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. And if you have any questions or concern, on behalf of Banner Alzheimer's Institute and Banner Sun Health Research Institute, Family and Community Service, where we have a ton of resources, not only just virtual presentations, but literature that will be obviously assist you as you care for your loved one. I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you all presenting. Allow me to present.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. That was very informative, and I love that you were able to share your personal story. Lots of good just tools that we can use. So I appreciate your time. And your email is in the chat within a few seconds, but you can, again, find the information on the website listed on the screen. And we appreciate your time.
Not a problem. So I'm sorry I sent it to one person, but I will make sure that there you go. You should all have it.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
God
Thank
bless
you.
Be
And
well.
I think okay. And I'm just gonna take this snapshot of this one person that just sent me their email so I can reach out. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.